He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull her aside. Cassian Viscari reached across his own wife's collarbone, unclasped the crimson crest that had rested there since their wedding night, and fastened it around Vivian Cross's throat in front of 400 witnesses. The ballroom went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne flutes. Seraphine Vale didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She stood perfectly still, her hands loose at her sides, and she smiled. Not the smile of a woman who'd lost, but of a woman who had just been handed permission to begin. Then the doors opened, and the most dangerous men on earth walked in and knelt. If this story moves you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. These stories don't repeat themselves. Part 1. The Romano Syndicate had been throwing its centennial gala for 6 weeks in the planning, and in those 6 weeks exactly one person had quietly made sure every detail was perfect. Not the event coordinator they'd hired out of Milan. Not Cassian's personal secretary, who'd been replaced twice since January. Seraphine Vale, Mrs. Cassian Viscari, whether anyone remembered to call her that, had walked the venue herself, in flat shoes and no jewelry, 3 times in the 10 days before the event. She'd tested the acoustics. She'd moved 2 tables without asking anyone. She'd replaced the floral arrangements on the east wall because the originals cast bad shadows on the faces of guests seated beneath the iron sconces. And bad shadows made powerful men look small, and powerful men who felt small made poor decisions. She understood these things because she had been watching powerful men make decisions since she was 4 years old. Nobody at the gala knew that. That was the point. The ballroom of the Palazzo Meridian sat 60 feet underground, accessible by a private elevator that required a mechanical key and a face scan, and it held, on this particular night, 412 people who collectively controlled more untaxed wealth than the GDP of several small nations. They came from New York, from Marseille, from Palermo and Prague, and a city in southern France whose name doesn't appear on civilian maps. They wore tuxedos cut to hide the weight of firearms. Their wives wore jewelry that had not been purchased. Seraphine wore a gown the color of old bone, no necklace, her dark hair pulled back so cleanly it looked architectural. She dressed without help. She always did. Cassian's household staff had learned years ago not to offer. She stood near the bar, not drinking, speaking with a man named Eduardo Falcone, who was 71 years old and ran the Eastern Mediterranean corridor with the particular efficiency of someone who'd once been a civil engineer before he was anything else. He had 3 daughters and no sons, and he was one of the few men in the room who looked at Seraphine the way you look at a person rather than a decoration. "You look tired," he said, which from Eduardo was intimacy. "I'm not," she said. He didn't argue. He just turned slightly, watching the room the way old men in their business watched rooms, not at the center, but at the edges. "He's been drinking since 5, he said. Seraphine didn't follow his gaze. She already knew where Cassian was. She always knew where Cassian was. "He's nervous." "Men like Cassian don't get nervous." "Men like Cassian," she said quietly, "are always nervous. They just call it something else." Eduardo made a small sound that might have been agreement. He touched the rim of his glass and didn't drink from it. "Vivian Cross is here," he said. "She came in through the service corridor." "I know. She's wearing red." "Of course she is." There was a pause. Eduardo set his glass down on the bar with the deliberateness of a man choosing his next words, as carefully as his next step across uncertain ground. "Seraphine," he said, "is there anything you need me to do tonight?" She looked at him then, full eye contact, which she used sparingly because she understood its weight. "No," she said. "Thank you, Eduardo." He nodded once, slowly, and walked away. Seraphine turned back to the room. Cassian was on the far side of the ballroom, near the window alcoves, his jacket unbuttoned in the way that meant the 3rd drink was already settling in. He was 46 and still built like someone who'd come up rough, which he had, thick through the shoulders, a jaw that looked like it had been carved with impatience. The silver at his temples was new this year. He wore it the way he wore everything, like he'd chosen it deliberately, like even aging was something he could make work for him. Vivian Cross was at his elbow. She was 32, and she was beautiful in the specific way that made rooms recalibrate when she entered them. The kind of beautiful that is both genuine and carefully managed, that takes an hour every morning to appear effortless. She laughed at something Cassian said and touched his sleeve, and didn't look in Seraphine's direction because she had spent months training herself not to look in Seraphine's direction, which was itself a form of awareness. 3 of Cassian's captains stood near enough to witness. 2 of them were watching Seraphine now, trying to read her face. She gave them nothing. The evening moved the way these evenings moved. Slow at first, then not. Speeches were made, toasts were given. The kind of men who measured respect in square footage of silence after their names were spoken took their turns at the microphone, and Seraphine listened to every word, cataloging tone and subtext the way she'd been taught to do before she could ride a bicycle. Cassian spoke last. He was a good speaker. She'd always given him that. He had the kind of voice that made rooms lean forward, low, with a rasp underneath it, not loud but somehow carrying. The voice of someone who'd learned early that being the quietest person in the room was often the most effective way to make everyone listen. He spoke about legacy, about the Romano Syndicate's 100 years, about the men who'd built it and the men who'd bled for it, and the obligation of the living to honor the dead without becoming them. He spoke about family. When he said the word, he didn't look at Seraphine. She noticed that. She noticed everything. The Crimson Crest had been in the Vescari family for 4 generations. It wasn't famous outside their world. The civilian press had never photographed it, had no record of it. But inside their world, it was recognized the way a national seal is recognized, not for its monetary value, though the rubies were Burmese and the gold was old, but for what it represented: authority, continuity. The declaration that someone carried the Vescari name as a living weight, and not just an inheritance. Cassian had placed it around Seraphine's neck the night of their wedding 7 years ago, in front of witnesses. It had been the gesture that made her position unambiguous. She was wearing it now. She felt it at her collarbone, as she always did. Not heavy, exactly, but present. A reminder. Of what? She had long since stopped asking. Cassian finished his speech. The room applauded. He stepped down from the low platform and accepted a glass of whiskey from a passing server and drank half of it without stopping, which told her more than the speech had. Then he crossed the ballroom. Not toward her, toward Vivian. Seraphine watched him walk. She watched the slight adjustment in his posture as he approached the other woman. A loosening, a dropping of the particular tension he carried in boardrooms and in their home, the tension of being Cassian Vescari at all times. He was softer with Vivian. Not weak, just unbuttoned. He hadn't been unbuttoned with Seraphine in a long time, if he ever had been. She didn't let herself feel that. She filed it and moved on. What she was not prepared for was what happened next. What she had not calculated, and she had run through many possibilities over many quiet evenings, sitting with her tea and her silence and her extraordinary memory, was that Cassian would choose this room, this night, these witnesses. He reached up and unclasped the crimson crest from Seraphine's throat. She hadn't heard him approach. She had been half turned toward the window, and she felt the cold of his hands at her nape before she registered that he was standing behind her, and she went very still in the way of someone who has learned that stillness is a form of armor. His fingers worked the clasp with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced the motion, and she thought, in the stretched second before understanding arrived, that he was adjusting it. Then she felt the absence, the weight lifting away. She turned. Cassian was already walking toward Vivian. The crimson crest dangled from his hand, rubies catching light, chains swinging with each step. The room had already noticed. The room always noticed when Cassian moved with purpose. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Heads turned. The particular silence that follows the recognition that something is happening, something real and irreversible, moved through the ballroom like a wave. He reached Vivian. She looked up at him, and something passed across her face. Surprise. Or the performance of surprise. Seraphine couldn't tell from this distance and told herself it didn't matter. And then Cassian lifted the crimson crest and fastened it around Vivian's neck. He turned to face the room. "The woman who stands beside me now," he said. And his voice was the same voice that had filled the room during his speech, carrying without effort, finding every corner, "is the woman who deserves to carry my legacy forward." That was all he said. 400 people heard it. Seraphine heard it from across the room, standing exactly where she'd been standing, her hands loose at her sides, her face doing nothing she hadn't told it to do. The room erupted in whispers. Of course it did. Eduardo Falcone found her eyes from across the room. His expression was the expression of a man watching a disaster in slow motion who understands that running would be undignified and possibly futile. Several of Cassian's captains were looking at their shoes. A few of the wives, women who had learned to survive by reading rooms correctly, were already recalibrating, already doing the invisible arithmetic of which side would emerge from this evening with power intact and which would not. Seraphine smiled, not at Cassian, not at Vivian, at nothing in particular or at everything in general, a small, private, almost amused expression that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with resolution. Then she walked to the coat check, retrieved her wrap, and moved toward the elevator. Nobody stopped her. Nobody knew whether to. The captains who might have intervened looked at one another and then looked at Cassian, who was receiving Vivian's breathless gratitude with the expression of a man who had just made an irreversible decision and had chosen, for now, not to think about its cost. The elevator doors closed behind Seraphine. She pressed the button for the lobby. In the quiet of the ascending car, she let herself close her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. She was still herself. She had always been more than she'd allowed this room to know. She had maintained the concealment deliberately, carefully, for 7 years, wearing the fiction of Seraphine veil the way a coat is worn over good clothes, protection against weather, never the full picture. The fiction was becoming inconvenient. She reached the lobby. She walked across the marble floor and through the glass doors and into the cold night air, and she breathed it in, the particular sharpness of late autumn, the smell of stone and exhaust and distant water. And she thought, now, not revenge. She was not a woman who confused revenge with strategy, which is the fundamental mistake most people make when they've been wronged. Revenge is emotional and therefore predictable. What she was thinking about was not revenge. She was thinking about what came next. She was still thinking about it when the cars began to arrive. 6 of them. 7. Black vehicles, not ostentatious, moving without escort or announcement, pulling to the curb in front of the Palazzo Meridian with the quiet efficiency of vehicles whose passengers do not require ceremony. The doorman, a young man named Tommaso, who had worked this entrance for 3 years and who prided himself on knowing every face that mattered, looked confused, then looked alarmed, then looked at Seraphine. She didn't look at him. The car doors opened. The men who stepped out were not young. They were not dressed for performance. They came in ordinary dark coats, and they moved with the particular economy of motion that belongs to men who have survived long enough in very dangerous professions to have burned away everything unnecessary. She recognized most of them. A few she knew only by description. Salvatore Marini, New York, who had not left his borough in 4 years without a security detail of 12. Remy Leclerc, Marseille, who had not been seen in public at a syndicate event in 2. Aldo Crisafulli, Palermo, whose attendance at anything was a message in itself. 4 more she placed within seconds. They did not announce themselves. They did not look at one another. They walked across the pavement toward the entrance of the Palazzo Meridian, and one by one they stopped when they reached the point where Seraphine was standing. And one by one, in the cold air, under the amber glow of the entrance lights, they knelt. Not a bow, not a nod. A full kneel, one knee, heads inclined, the gesture of absolute and unconditional acknowledgement that has not changed across cultures or centuries because some things are older than etiquette. Tommaso the doorman had backed up against the glass. Seraphine stood very still. Inside the Palazzo Meridian, 60 feet below ground, a ballroom full of the most powerful people in the criminal world had their backs to the elevator. They were still processing what Cassian had done. Some of them were already deciding how to use it. Some of them were angry on Seraphine's behalf, not from sentiment, but from the instinctive discomfort that comes from watching someone with unacknowledged power get visibly dismissed. The feeling that something is being misread, that a calculation is off somewhere, that someone in this room doesn't have all the information. They didn't know yet how right that feeling was. They didn't know that the woman who had just ridden the elevator up and out of the building was not the woman who'd been in it 7 years. That the fiction had served its purpose, and the coat was coming off. And underneath it was something none of them, not Cassian, not Vivienne, not even Lucien Moretti, who prided himself on knowing everything, had ever seen. Outside, on the cold pavement, Salvatore Marini looked up at Seraphine from where he knelt and said, very quietly, We got your signal. I know, she said. We came as quickly as we could. You came at exactly the right time, she said. Get up, all of you. We have work to do. She turned and walked back through the glass doors, and they rose and followed her, and Tommaso the doorman stood against the wall with his hands at his sides and did not make a single sound, because he understood, the way people in proximity to genuine power sometimes understand without being able to explain it, that he had just witnessed the end of one world and the very quiet beginning of another. The elevator descended. 400 people looked up when the doors opened. None of them looked at the men who stepped out. They were all looking at Seraphine. She crossed the ballroom floor without hurrying, which was its own kind of message. The woman who does not need to rush because the room has already adjusted to her. Her wrap was gone. Her back was straight. Her face was the face she kept for moments that required absolute precision, which was not cold exactly, but clean, emptied of everything that didn't serve the next 60 seconds. She walked directly toward the center of the room. Behind her, Salvatore Marini, Remy Leclerc, Aldo Crisafulli, and 4 more, and they fanned out as they moved, filling space without crowding it, the unconscious geometry of men who've spent their lives navigating rooms where position meant survival. The whispers that had followed Cassian's gesture were gone. The room was completely silent. Cassian stood near the platform, Vivian at his side, the crimson crest bright at her throat. He watched Seraphine come toward him, and he watched the men who came behind her, and she saw the moment, the precise moment, when his face changed. When the piece he'd been missing inserted itself into the picture, he thought he understood. He looked at Salvatore Marini. Marini looked through him. He looked at Leclerc. Leclerc was watching Seraphine. Cassian's jaw tightened. "What is this?" he said. Not loud. The voice he used when he was controlling something just barely. Seraphine stopped 6 feet from him. "This," she said, and her voice was the same voice she'd always had in this room, measured, unhurried, carrying without effort, "is the part of the evening that wasn't on your agenda." "Seraphine, you can finish that sentence," she said. "You'll want to choose carefully what you put at the end of it." The silence in the room had become a physical thing. 400 people holding the particular stillness of witnesses, the instinct to make no movement that could be misinterpreted, to give no signal that could be used against them later, to simply watch and understand and remember. Vivian Cross had one hand at her throat, at the crimson crest. Her fingers had closed around it the way you close your hand around something you don't yet know is hot. Cassian looked at his wife. For the first time in a very long time, he looked at her the way you look at something you've mistaken for familiar, with the beginning of a terrible recalculation. "Who are you?" he said. It was the wrong question, they both knew it, but it was the only honest thing he'd said to her in years. Seraphine held his gaze. Behind her, without a word, without signal, without anything but the particular gravity that belongs to a moment whose time has come, Salvatore Marini lowered himself to one knee, and then Remy Leclerc, and then Aldo Crisafulli, and 4 more behind them. On the cold marble floor of the Palazzo Meridian's underground ballroom, in front of 400 witnesses, the most dangerous men on 3 continents knelt before a woman whose name none of them had spoken aloud in 7 years. Cassian watched it happen. His face was doing something she'd never seen it do before, something that had no name in the vocabulary of the man he'd built himself to be, something that lived in the small hours and the unguarded moment and the space between what a man believes about himself and what the evidence suggests. Vivian's hand dropped from the crimson crest. Seraphine looked at her husband for a long, quiet moment. "My name," she said, "is not what you think it is, and your empire is not what you think it is. And tonight," she paused, not for effect, but because the next sentence required precision, "is the first night of something you don't have a word for yet." She turned away from him. She faced the room. 400 people watched her, and not one of them made a sound. And in that silence, the answer to Cassian's question was already present, already clear, already settling into the bones of everyone who would carry this night forward into every decision they made for the rest of their lives. She did not explain herself. She didn't need to. The kneeling men were explanation enough. The room didn't move for a long time after that. Not because anyone was frozen by sentiment. These were not sentimental people. They were still because every one of them was doing the same rapid, cold calculation, running the numbers on what they'd just witnessed against everything they thought they knew, and the math wasn't coming out right. Not for any of them. Cassian stood near the platform with his jaw set and his glass empty, and his eyes moving between the kneeling men and his wife's back. And what was happening on his face was not anger, not yet. It was something uglier. The particular expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the floor he's been standing on is not the floor he thought it was, and that the distance to the real ground beneath it is considerable. Vivian Cross had both hands at her sides now, fingers straight, the posture of someone who has recognized danger and is trying very hard not to show it. The crimson crest sat at her throat, and it no longer looked like a prize. It looked like a sign she was holding that said something she hadn't read yet. The 7 men rose from their knees without hurry, without ceremony, without any of the self-consciousness that the gesture might have carried in a different room. They rose the way men rise when they've done something necessary and now need to do the next necessary thing. They positioned themselves, not around Seraphine exactly, but in relation to her the way points on a compass relate to north. Cassian found his voice. Seraphine. Not a question, a command dressed as a name. She turned. Outside, he said. No, she said. The single syllable landed in the room like a stone in still water, clean, immediate, the ripple spreading before anyone had registered the impact. In 7 years of marriage, in 1,000 rooms, in every encounter that mattered, Seraphine had never said that word to Cassian in public. She disagreed quietly, redirected carefully, absorbed what needed absorbing, and released what needed releasing. And not once had she offered that particular word in that particular tone in front of witnesses. Cassian heard it the way it was intended. You want to do this here, he said. I'm not doing anything, she said. I'm standing here. You're the one who did something. Seraphine, in front of 400 people, she said. You made a choice in front of 400 people, Cassian. Don't ask me to honor it with privacy. His throat moved. He set the empty glass on the nearest table without looking at it, and it tipped slightly, and no one reached to steady it. You don't know what you're walking into, he said. His voice had dropped into the register he used when he meant to be believed. Tell me, she said. What am I walking into? He didn't answer, because he didn't know. She could see it on him. The man who had run this syndicate for 18 years with the particular arrogance of someone who believed he understood every room he entered had just found a door. He hadn't known was there, and behind it was not a room but a hallway, and he couldn't see where the hallway ended. Lucienne Moretti materialized from the left. She'd been watching for him. Lucienne was 53, thin in the way of a man who forgets to eat because he's too absorbed in thinking, with pale eyes that never landed on anything for long. He was Cassian's consigliere, his counselor, his planner, the architect of 18 years of successful strategy. And he wore his position the way some men wear good watches, not for show, but because they genuinely believe the instrument is the best available. He moved through the room with the careful efficiency of someone taking inventory, and when he reached Cassian's side, he leaned in and said something that Seraphine was too far away to hear. She watched Cassian's response to it. His eyes came back to her immediately. Whatever Lucienne had said, it had changed something. Salvatore, Cassian said. Salvatore Marini looked at him. How long? Cassian said. How long have you known about her? Marini took his time answering. He was a man who had learned that silence was not just the absence of speech, but its own complete sentence, and he deployed it the way other men deployed volume. Long enough, he said finally. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have for you right now. Cassian's jaw tightened. He looked at Leclerc, at Crisafulli, reading them, finding nothing. These were men who had survived by being unreadable, and they were being professionally unreadable at him right now, and it was costing him something, the specific cost of being the person in the room who knows least. He turned back to Seraphine. The House of D'Aurelio, he said. The room didn't react. Most of the people in it were too young to place the name, or had heard it only as something historical, cautionary, past. A massacre, 28 years ago. A dynasty eliminated before most of these captains had made their first serious mistake. The story that got told in certain circles when people needed to explain why some debts never expired. Eduardo Falcone, near the far wall, had gone very still. Seraphine said nothing. The daughter, Cassian said. His voice had gone somewhere stripped and flat. They said the daughter was dead. They said a lot of things, Seraphine said. You're telling me... I'm not telling you anything. You're figuring it out. That's different. 7 years. The number came out of him like something physical. 7 years I've had you in my house, in my bed, at my table. At your table, she said. Yes. I was very useful at your table, Cassian. You just weren't paying attention to what I was doing there. Something moved across his face then. Not anger. He'd found his anger and was holding it back deliberately, which was its own kind of warning. What moved across his face was something more complicated. Something that in another man, in another life, might have been the beginning of grief. Vivian Cross said, Cassian. Both of them looked at her. She'd been standing very still for several minutes, and the stillness had cost her something. There were 2 spots of color in her cheeks, and her breathing was not quite even. She'd understood enough of what was being said to understand that the object around her neck had become something different in the last 3 minutes. Not a gift, a liability. Cassian, she said again, and this time her voice had something in it she probably hadn't intended to show. Tell me what's happening. He looked at her. And in the look was the answer she didn't want, which was that he didn't know, and that not knowing was not something he had a procedure for. She reached up, unclasped the crimson crest, held it out toward him. He didn't take it. She set it on the table beside her next to a half-empty wine glass, and it sat there under the chandelier light, and it looked like exactly what it was, a beautiful object whose significance everyone in the room was reassessing simultaneously. Lucien Moretti was watching Seraphine with the pale eyes that never landed anywhere for long, and they were landing on her now, and she felt the specific quality of his attention the way you feel weather changing. He was not surprised. That was the thing she noted and filed. Everyone else in this room was at some point on the spectrum between shock and recalibration. Lucien was neither. He was watching her with the focused interest of a man who is confirming something he already knew, and the implications of that required thought she wasn't going to spend on it here, in this moment, in front of witnesses. Later. She would think about Lucien later. The bloodline, Eduardo Falcone said. His voice carried from the far wall without effort, the voice of an old man who'd stopped worrying about whether he was allowed to speak. Every head in the room turned toward him. The D'Aurelio bloodline, he said, moving toward the center of the room with the particular gravity of someone who has information and has decided the time for holding it is past. The Accord of 1953. 22 families, 6 continents. Every treaty, every territory, every peace agreement that is held for 30 years. All of it was written under D'Aurelio authority and can only be ratified, amended, or dissolved by D'Aurelio blood. He stopped walking. He was standing equidistant from Cassian and Seraphine, which was its own kind of position. The crimson crest is a symbol, a family heirloom, pretty, meaningful within the vestry line. But the actual authority... He paused, and in the pause, every person in the room understood that what came next would reset something has been sleeping in this room for 7 years. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Seraphine had heard since the night her family's house burned. Cassian turned to look at her. She met his eyes. Why? He said. One word. The most honest question he'd ever asked her. She took a breath. Because I needed to be certain, she said, that the right person had it. And am I? He said. The right person? She looked at him for a long moment, at the man she'd chosen 7 years ago for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and then lived beside for long enough that the reasons had gotten complicated in ways she hadn't budgeted for. At the set of his jaw and the thing in his eyes that was asking her something real. Finally, something real. No, she said, you're not. He absorbed that. His head dropped slightly, the most private movement she'd ever seen him make in public. Then he straightened. Who is? He said. She turned away from him, which was his answer. The night cracked open after that. Not immediately. These things don't happen immediately when the room is full of people who've survived by not reacting immediately. But in the 40 minutes that followed, as Seraphine sat at the head of the long table in the private room off the main ballroom with Marini and Leclerc and Crisafulli and 4 others arranged in the chairs that held the most weight, and as various captains filtered in and out and conversations she was not part of, happened in alcoves she could track by the sound of shoes on marble. In those 40 minutes, the Romano Syndicate's centennial gala became something else entirely. Cassian didn't come to the private room. Lucian did. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, which was unusual for him. Lucien Moretti did not stand in doorways. He was a man who either entered or he didn't, and standing on the threshold of a decision was not his way. But he stood there for a beat, pale eyes moving across the room, landing on each face, counting and cataloging and doing the arithmetic she'd seen him do 100 times in 100 different rooms. Then he came in. He took the chair to her left, which was the chair closest to the door, which told her something. The timing, he said, without preamble. You planned this for tonight. The timing planned itself, she said. He chose tonight. I adjusted. You've been ready for it for a while. I've been ready for something, she said. Ready for this specific evening? No, I would have given him more time. Lucian turned his glass in his hands. He wasn't drinking from it either. And if he hadn't done it, if he'd left the crest where it was, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But eventually, she said, is not tonight. Tonight is tonight. Let's deal with tonight. Lucien was quiet. Around the table, Marini was talking in a low voice with Crisafulli, and Leclerc had his phone out and was reading something on it with no visible expression, and the two men Seraphine knew less well, Beaumont, from Lyon, and a very old man named Testa, who ran the Sardinian routes and who had not spoken yet, were watching the conversation between Seraphine and Lucien with the careful attention of people who are trying to determine which of two things is the more dangerous. She knew which it was. She'd known which it was for some time. He's going to want to talk to you, Lucien said. Tonight, tomorrow. He's not going to simply absorb this and move on. That's not who he is. No, she agreed. It's not. What do you want me to tell him? She looked at Lucien, directly, with the full attention she usually parceled out carefully. Tell him, she said, that I'm not going anywhere, that I'd like to speak with him in the morning, that tonight he should… She paused, rest, and stop drinking, and think about what questions he actually wants answers to, because I'm only going through them once. Lucien nodded slowly. He stood. He smoothed the front of his jacket with both hands, a gesture she'd seen him make 1,000 times, the unconscious finishing touch of a man who equates composure with straightened fabric. Seraphine, he said. She waited. Welcome back, he said. She held his gaze. I was never gone, she said. He left. She watched the door close behind him, and then she picked up her own glass, the one she hadn't touched, and drank from it. Not because she needed it, but because the next several hours were going to require a different quality of endurance than the last several had, and even she was allowed to mark the transition. Marini leaned toward her. You trust him? Low voice, not quite a whisper. No, she said. Marini nodded as if she'd confirmed something. He looked at the closed door. He came in too calm, he said. Yes. A man hears what just happened in that ballroom. He doesn't come in calm. No, he doesn't. Marini was quiet for a moment, then, so either he already knew, or he helped make it happen, she said. Yes, I know. I've been thinking about that. And Lucien Moretti, she said carefully, has been Cassian's consigliere for 18 years. He has planned every major move this organization has made, every territory acquired, every alliance sealed. She set her glass down. He also recommended me to Cassian. Did you know that? Marini's face changed. 7 years ago, she said, when Cassian was looking for a match that would consolidate his social position without complicating his operational one, Lucien was the one who found my name, my cover name. He presented me as the daughter of a regional businessman with clean hands and a good family. Cassian did his due diligence, found exactly what Lucien wanted him to find, and married me within the year. She looked at her hands on the table. It took me 3 years to figure out whether that was coincidence. And? She looked up. It was not, she said. Salvatore Marini sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, doing the arithmetic. When he looked back down, his expression had the particular quality of a man who has just added a number to a column and found that the total changes everything. He knows who you are, he said. He's known since before Cassian did. He put you there. He put me there. Why? She was quiet for a moment. This was the question she'd been sitting with for 4 years, working at its edges, testing different answers against the evidence, discarding the ones that didn't hold. Because I'm the key, she said. To the accord. To the D'Aurelio authority. And as long as I'm inside Cassian's house, married to Cassian's name, my authority is… She paused. Adjacent to whoever controls Cassian. The room went very quiet. Leclerc had put down his phone. Testa, the old Sardinian man who hadn't spoken, said, he wanted access. Everyone looked at him. To the bloodline authority, Testa said. His voice was the voice of a man who'd had too many cigarettes for too many decades, but who had survived everything that had tried to kill him, and had arrived at 81 with the kind of clarity that comes from having no illusions left to lose. Not to Cassian's power. Cassian's power was the vehicle. The real target was always the D'Aurelio seal, the ability to invoke the accord. Moretti's been building toward it for… He stopped. How many years has he been running the operation? 18, Cassian's senior captain, a man named Pharaoh, who had come in quietly 20 minutes earlier and taken a seat near the wall without being invited, said from across the room. He was looking at his own hands. He joined the organization 18 years ago. Seraphine looked at Pharaoh. Pharaoh looked back at her. I was 50, thick through the neck, with the face of a man who'd thrown punches and taken them, and had arrived at middle age with the particular loyalty that comes from having given too much of yourself to something to ever comfortably walk away from it. He'd been Cassian since his 20s. He was not, she'd always assessed, a complicated man, but he was a loyal one, and loyalty sometimes produced clarity that cleverness missed. Pharaoh, she said, what do you know? I know, he said slowly, that I've had a bad feeling about that man for 6 months, and I couldn't name what it was until right now, sitting in this chair, listening to you talk. A bad feeling about what, specifically? He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man assembling something he wasn't sure he wanted to assemble. There have been 7 operations in the last 8 months, he said. Small ones. Territory disputes, courier interceptions, a problem with a warehouse in Genoa. Every one of them, Moretti handled the intelligence. Moretti told Cassian what was happening, where the threat was coming from, who was behind it. And the answers were always clean, he said. Too clean. He always knew exactly who to blame. He always had the name within 48 hours, and every name he gave… He stopped. Was someone positioned to move against Cassian's authority? Seraphine finished. Pharaoh looked at her with the expression of a man who is both relieved and unsettled to have someone else see what he's been seeing. 18 years of working next to someone, he said. You don't want to think… No, she said. You don't. But if what you're saying is right, if he put you here deliberately, if the last 8 months of intel has been manufactured, then Cassian has been systematically isolated, Marini said. His voice had gone to a different place, operational, the voice of a man switching modes. His allies undermined one by one, his judgment compromised, and tonight… He stopped. Tonight, Seraphine said carefully, Cassian handed the Crimson Crest to a woman in front of witnesses, publicly dismantled his own wife's position, made himself look impulsive, disloyal, politically unstable. She looked at the center of the table. Who benefits from that? The answer was in the room before anyone said it. He needed Cassian to break the marriage publicly, Leclerc said. His French accent thickened slightly when he was working something out. She'd noticed that before. If you're still Cassian's wife, your authority reflects on him, on the Viscari name. It complicates Moretti's access. But if Cassian publicly humiliates you, publicly breaks the bond… He exhaled through his nose. You're separated from the Viscari name without a divorce, without legal proceedings, without anything that leaves a clean paper trail. And then someone steps into the gap. Someone who's been there for 18 years, Pharaoh said. The room held that. Outside, somewhere in the building above them, a door closed. Footsteps. The low murmur of voices carrying through stone and steel and marble, the building's ambient conversation. The hundreds of people still at the gala who didn't know that the evening had turned into something they hadn't dressed for. Seraphine looked at the ceiling for a moment. She was thinking about Vivian Cross. She was thinking about a woman who'd been handed something valuable and hadn't known what it was, who'd stood in a ballroom in a red dress while 400 people recalculated her significance, who'd taken the crest off and set it on a table because the self-preservation instinct of a genuinely intelligent person kicks in when the ground moves. Vivian Cross was not a fool. She was a woman who'd read Cassian Viscari correctly enough to occupy a position most people would have found untenable. And that took a specific kind of intelligence. And that kind of intelligence noticed things. She wondered what Vivian had noticed about Lucien. She wondered how long Vivian had been in contact with Lucien, whether Vivian knew whose idea she'd been, whether the woman in the red dress was another carefully placed piece or a genuine accident that Moretti had simply incorporated into his design. She would need to talk to Vivian. Not tonight. Tonight she needed to... The door opened without a knock. Cassian. He stood in the doorway and he looked at the room, and the room looked at him, and he was... She saw it in the first half second before she composed her response. He was badly rattled. Not drunk, or no longer drunk. The adrenaline of the last 2 hours burning through what the whiskey had built. He was pale under the olive of his complexion, and his jacket was somewhere else, and he was in his shirt sleeves, and he looked like what he was, which was a man who had made an enormous mistake and had spent the last 2 hours discovering how much larger it was than he'd known when he made it. He looked at the faces around the table, at Marini, who didn't move, at Pharaoh, who looked at his hands again, at Seraphine. "Vivienne is gone," he said. She went still. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, her suite is empty, and her car is not in the garage, and—" He stopped. His throat moved. "And one of my men is unconscious in the service corridor." The room came to its feet. Not in chaos. These were not people who moved in chaos, but with the specific rapid efficiency of people who have been in the business of danger long enough that their bodies move toward threat before their minds finish processing it. Marini had his phone out. Leclerc was already at the door. Seraphine stood. "She didn't leave on her own," she said. It was not a question. "The driver is ours," Cassian said. His voice had stripped further. He was down to the operational core of himself. The part that existed below the anger and the pride and the marriage. The part that had kept him alive for 18 years in a business where most people didn't make 10. "I've used him for 8 years. He wouldn't..." "Where did the car go?" "South." Camera picked it up on the Via Martucci, heading toward the Port District. Seraphine looked at Marini. Marini looked at her. The Port District. The Genoa warehouse. The 8 operations Pharaoh had listed, all with Moretti's intelligence, all pointing at enemies who weren't quite where they were supposed to be. "He's moving," she said. "Tonight?" Pharaoh's voice had gone sharp. "Why tonight? Why now?" "Because tonight is when everything changed," she said. She was already walking toward the door. "Because he spent 18 years building this, and tonight the board shifted in a way he didn't plan for, and a man who operates on timelines adjusts his timeline when he has to." She stopped at the door, looked at Cassian. "Where's Lucien right now?" Cassian's face went through something. "He left," he said. 20 minutes ago. He said he was going to speak with you." She looked at him. "He didn't come to me," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't have a comfortable edge to it. The silence of something irreversible settling into place, of a door closing somewhere that cannot be reopened, of a man understanding in real time that the person he'd trusted most and longest had been using that trust as a key that opened a lock he hadn't known existed. Cassian's hands came up and pressed flat against the doorframe, and he stood there and breathed. "Cassian," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who is discovering the distance between who he thought he was and what the evidence requires him to be, and the discovery was costing him something that would take years to tally. "We need to move now," she said. "Everything else, what happened tonight, between us, what comes after, that waits. Right now there is a woman somewhere in this city who knows things she shouldn't, who is in the hands of a man who has been building toward something for 18 years. And if we don't find her before he decides she's a liability instead of an asset..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Cassian pushed off the doorframe. "Tell me what you need," he said. And in that moment, in the stripped and ugly honesty of the worst night of his life, he was finally speaking to her the way she'd waited 7 years to be spoken to. Without the performance, without the management, without any of the comfortable distance that power affords. Too late, probably. But late was different from never, and she would sort out what it meant after they'd found Vivian Cross alive. She walked out the door and he followed her, and behind them the room was already moving, already deploying, already becoming the thing it needed to become. And somewhere in the Port District, in a car that had turned south on the Via Martucci 40 minutes ago, Vivienne Cross was sitting with something around her neck that no longer meant what anyone had told her it meant, riding toward a destination she hadn't chosen, in the company of a man who had used everything and everyone in this story as a piece on a board she hadn't known existed. And she was smart enough to know that the moment she stopped being useful was the moment she needed to start being very, very afraid. The Port District at 2 in the morning smelled like diesel and salt, and something underneath both of those things that had no clean name. The particular odor of a place where commerce happens without paperwork, where the things that move through in the dark are not the things that appear on any manifest. Seraphine knew this district. She'd walked it once, 3 years ago, alone, in flat shoes and a coat that didn't belong to her, because she'd needed to understand the geography of a place Cassian kept mentioning without explaining. She'd mapped it in her head the way she mapped everything: exits, sight lines, the distance between one building and the next, the rhythm of the security rotations at the 3 warehouses that the Romano Syndicate maintained along the southern quay. She hadn't known then why she was mapping it. She'd learned to trust the instinct that said, "Remember this. You'll need it." She needed it now. The convoy moved in 3 vehicles, Cassian's men in the lead car, Marini's 2 people in the rear, and in the center a black sedan carrying Seraphine, Cassian, Pharaoh, and a man named Drouet who worked for Leclerc and who had, according to Leclerc, the specific skill set that the next 2 hours might require. Drouet had said nothing since getting in the car. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked out the window and breathed evenly, which was its own form of communication. Cassian had not spoken since they left the Palazzo Meridian. He sat beside her in the dark of the moving car, and she could feel the quality of his silence. Not the silence of a man collecting himself, but the silence of a man being taken apart and not knowing which pieces to save. His hands were flat on his thighs. He was staring at the back of the seat in front of him with the focused blankness of someone who is thinking too many things simultaneously for any of them to surface clearly. She let him have the silence. She was using her own. Pharaoh said, from the front passenger seat, "Warehouse 3. That's where the Genoa problem was staged from. Moretti ran the intelligence on that one personally." "I remember," Cassian said. 2 words. The voice of a man going through something underwater. "If he's using it tonight, he knows we know about Warehouse 3, Seraphine said. Pharaoh turned. "Then why?" "Because he's not hiding," she said. "He doesn't need to hide. He's had 18 years to build contingencies inside this organization. He knows exactly how fast we can move and what our resources look like and which of Cassian's men will hesitate before acting against someone they've eaten dinner with for a decade." She looked out the window at the dark streets moving past. "He's not at Warehouse 3, but he wants someone to go to Warehouse 3. Pharaoh was quiet for a moment. "A diversion." "Or a trap," Drouet said. His first words. His voice was surprisingly mild for someone sitting the way he was sitting. Cassian's jaw moved. "Then where?" Seraphine looked at her hands. She was thinking about the morning Lucian had come to her, 18 months ago, a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary morning that looks like nothing until you understand what it contained. He'd brought coffee to her sitting room, which was unusual. Lucian did not make domestic gestures. He'd sat across from her and they'd talked about a pending alliance with a Leon family, and she'd watched his eyes and noticed that they moved differently than usual. Landing on things, staying. He'd been assessing her. She'd thought at the time that she was being paranoid. She had not been paranoid. "There's a dry dock facility," she said, "south of the main quay, past the commercial terminal. It's listed under a holding company that doesn't appear in any Romano Syndicate documentation because it was acquired through a shell company in 2019. She paused. "Lucien set up the acquisition. I found the paperwork 8 months ago, in a file I wasn't meant to access, in a directory on the organization's server that was labeled with a routing code used exclusively for inactive accounts." The car was quiet. "You've known for 8 months, Cassian said. "I've known something for 8 months, she said. "I didn't know what. I needed more." "You needed more." He said it without inflection, which was worse than if he'd been angry. "Cassian." She turned to look at him directly. "I had a name on a file in a shell company and an instinct. I didn't have evidence. I didn't have motive. I didn't have the shape of it. If I'd come to you 8 months ago with a shell company and a bad feeling about your consigliere of 18 years. He didn't answer, because he knew the answer. He would not have listened. He would have been offended. He would have managed her the way he managed everything that didn't fit the picture he'd already decided on. I needed tonight, she said quietly. I needed him to move, because until he moved, I couldn't show you what he was moving toward. Cassian looked at her for a long time. Then he looked back at the seat in front of him. The dry dock, he said to Pharaoh. Pharaoh relayed it to the lead car. They turned south. The dry dock facility sat at the end of a service road that branched off the main quay access behind a commercial refrigeration depot. No signage. Motion-activated lights that were currently dark. 3 vehicles already in the small parking area outside the main structure. 2 black, 1 gray, none of them registered to anything a casual search would surface. Cassian's lead car stopped 200 meters short. They sat. Seraphine looked at the facility. A long, low building, corrugated metal, 1 large roll door on the near face, and a smaller personnel door to the left of it. 2 sight lines from the roof, so she could see the shape of someone up there, which meant the approach was already being monitored. Lights inside the building, showing under the roll door. Activity. How many? Cassian asked Druitt. Druitt had been looking at the facility through a scope taken from a bag that had appeared from somewhere in the car. 2 on the roof, he said. Minimum 4 at ground level inside, based on the shadows through the door gap. There may be more. He lowered the scope. They're positioned to receive, not to repel. The roof placement is watching the road, not providing cover fire positions. They expected someone to come. They're just not sure how many. Vivienne is inside, Seraphine said. Not a question. Reasonable assumption, Druitt said. She's alive, Seraphine said. Also not a question, but a different kind. Druitt looked at her. For now, she's currency. Until she isn't. Cassian reached for the door handle. Seraphine put her hand on his arm. He stopped. If you go in there the way you want to go in there, she said, people die. Possibly including Vivienne, possibly including you. And if you die tonight, every alliance I just reactivated, every commitment those 7 men made when they knelt in that ballroom, all of it becomes a question mark, because the authority to invoke the accord requires stability, and a dead Cassian Viscari the night of the Romano Centennial Gala is the opposite of stability. So what do you suggest? He said tightly. I go first, she said. The sound he made was not quite a word. Lucien needs me functional, she said. That's the whole architecture of this. He spent 18 years building toward the D'Aurelio authority. He can't use it if I'm dead, and he can't use it if I'm unwilling, and he knows that, so going in first is the safest position available in this situation. That is an insane... Cassian. Her hand was still on his arm. She could feel the muscle under his sleeve, the rigid tension of a man holding himself at the edge of a decision. I have been making calculated decisions in dangerous rooms since before you knew my real name. Trust me to make this one. He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. 5 minutes, he said. 10. 7. Fine, she said. 7. She got out of the car. The night air was colder here, closer to the water, carrying the smell of the sea in a way that had iron in it. She walked the service road without hurrying, without looking at the roof, keeping her hands visible and her pace even, the walk of someone who has arrived rather than someone who has intruded. At the personnel door, she stopped and knocked twice. A pause. The door opened. The man inside was not someone she recognized, which told her something. Lucien had resources outside the Romano Syndicate, assets built separately, his own infrastructure. The man looked at her, looked behind her at the empty road, and stepped back. She went in. The inside of the dry dock facility was large and mostly empty. The dock mechanism itself dominated the center, the dry berth currently holding nothing, the overhead rigging casting shadow patterns across the concrete floor, floodlights on standing poles at 3 points. And in the open space between the dock and the far wall, arranged with the particular deliberateness of a man who thinks in tableau, Lucien Moretti, standing. Vivienne Cross, seated in a chair that was not tied to, but might as well have been, given the 2 men positioned on either side of her, and 4 more men distributed around the periphery who had the look of people hired recently and specifically for this. Vivienne's face when she saw Seraphine was complicated, Relief and fear and something that might have been shame, the expression of a woman who understands she is the reason other people are in a bad room tonight. Lucian looked at Seraphine with the pale eyes and the expression of a man who has won the hand he was playing, and is now simply waiting for the other players to acknowledge the cards. "You came alone," he said. "I came ahead," she said. "There's a difference. Cassian is outside." "Yes." "How many men?" "Enough," she said, "and not enough to solve this with what you're imagining. So let's not spend time on that arithmetic. You have something I need. I have something you need. Let's talk about it like adults." Lucian tilted his head. "You make it sound like a negotiation." "Everything is a negotiation." "Not this," he said. "Not anymore." He moved toward her. Not threatening, just repositioning, the movement of a man who is accustomed to controlling the geometry of a room. "You've been very patient, Seraphine, very careful. 7 years of, what was the word Eduardo used? Sleeping. The authority sleeping." He stopped 10 feet from her. "But you made a mistake tonight." She waited. "You showed them who you are," he said. "You let Marini kneel. You let the room see it. You made it real." He paused. "Before tonight, you were a rumor inside my head, a possibility. After tonight, you're a fact, and facts require resolution." "What kind of resolution are you proposing?" He looked at her. "The accord," he said. "The D'Aurelio seal. The ability to invoke, ratify, and restructure every agreement under the 1953 Compact. You transfer that authority to me, formally, in front of witnesses I select, and everyone in this building walks out of it tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know that's not how it works," she said. "The authority is bloodline. It can't be transferred." "The instrument can be," he said. "The document of conveyance. The D'Aurelio family maintained physical documentation of the succession, the original accord, the bloodline register, the seal itself. All of it disappeared when the house burned." He paused. "Except it didn't disappear, did it?" She said nothing. "You've had it," he said, "the whole time, somewhere. And tonight I need you to tell me where it is, and I need you to sign the conveyance document I've had prepared for 2 years, and then this is over. And if I don't..." He glanced at Vivian. Vivian looked at Seraphine with the expression of someone who did not ask to be used as a bargaining chip and is aware of the indignity of the position and the danger of showing it. "She's not a reason for me to sign anything," Seraphine said. "I know that," Lucian said. "She was never the reason. She was a message, an invitation." He put his hands in his pockets. "The reason is standing outside in a car making a decision about whether to come in here with guns." She felt something shift under her. "Cassian," he said. "My liability. My mistake. I built him into something extraordinary, and then I miscalculated. I gave him too much autonomy, let him develop too much genuine attachment to his own authority, and he became..." Lucian paused, searching for the word. "Inconvenient. He was supposed to serve a specific purpose, and he exceeded that purpose, and that made him difficult to manage." Another pause. "Tonight gave me the opportunity to correct that." She was very still. "The public humiliation," she said. "The crimson crest." "Was my suggestion," Lucian said, 3 weeks ago. I told him Vivian had found documentation suggesting you were planning to invoke the D'Aurelio authority against his leadership, that you'd been building relationships with the old families behind his back, that if he didn't make a preemptive move to strip your position publicly, you would move first. He said it without effect, the way you recite a list. He didn't want to, for what it's worth. He argued against it for 2 weeks. I was persuasive. The floor. She could feel it, the floor of the picture she'd been building, the architecture of the last 7 years, developing a crack that ran all the way through it and changed the shape of every assumption she'd been standing on. Cassian had not acted out of arrogance alone. He had acted out of fear. Manufactured fear, planted with surgical precision by the man he trusted most, the man who knew every weakness, every insecurity, every point where Cassian Viscari was vulnerable to the specific lie that his own wife was moving against him. She thought about the night 3 months ago when Cassian had been cold in a way she couldn't account for. The distance that had appeared between them that she'd attributed to the ordinary erosion of a marriage conducted under impossible conditions. The evenings he'd stopped coming to dinner. The way he'd looked at her sometimes with something she'd read as contempt, and was now standing here recalibrating as something closer to fear. He'd been afraid of her, because Lucien had told him to be. "You used him," she said. "I built him," Lucien said without any particular emotion. "There's a difference. And now? Now he's served his purpose. Tonight, when he comes through that door, and he will come through that door because I know him, and he cannot stay in that car. He will come in here and he will see you in this room and he will make a decision that costs him, and either outcome removes the obstacle." Lucien looked at her. "Unless you sign the document before he gets here, in which case I have no further use for this location, and everyone leaves." "You'll kill him anyway," she said. "Probably," Lucien agreed, "but not tonight, and not here. And not because of anything you did or didn't do, which is a distinction that matters, I think, to someone with your particular moral architecture." She looked at him, at the pale eyes that were finally, fully, completely visible to her, all the patience in them, all the accumulated calculation, 18 years of a design so intricate that it had survived 7 years of her looking directly at it, from the inside without seeing its full shape. "The documentation," she said. "You think I have it here, in the city?" "I think you have access to it," he said. "Yes." "And the conveyance document." He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded document, cream paper, dense text. He held it out. She didn't take it. "I need to read it," she said. He brought it to her, placed it in her hands, stepped back. She unfolded it. It was real. 2 years of preparation, as he'd said. Legal language she recognized from the D'Aurelio family's own records. Language specific enough that it could not have been drafted without access to the original documentation. Language that, signed and witnessed, would create a legitimate instrument of conveyance that could be presented to the assembled families as valid transfer of authority. It would not be valid. The bloodline could not be conveyed by document, but most of the men who would see this document didn't know that, and the ones who did could be managed, and by the time anyone determined with certainty that it was fraudulent, Lucien would have used it to invoke the accord, restructure the alliances, and establish a position so entrenched that the question of validity would be academic. She was reading the 4th paragraph when the personnel door opened. Not at 7 minutes. At 4. Cassian came through the door with Pharaoh behind him, and 2 men she didn't recognize. Not Romano organization, not Marini's people, faces she had never seen. And the room's geometry changed immediately, all of Lucien's positioned men shifting, and Lucien himself turned with the expression of a man who has had a variable enter his equation ahead of schedule. "Cassian," Lucien said. Cassian looked at Seraphine, at the document in her hands. His face did something she could not fully interpret. A rapid series of adjustments, reading the room, reading her, reading Vivian in the chair, and Lucien 10 feet away, and the hired men at the periphery, and the document. "Don't," he said. "I'm reading it," she said. "I know what it is," he said. "He told me about it 6 months ago. He told me—" He stopped, jaw working. "He told me it was insurance, that you had the documentation, and that if you ever decided to move against the organization, he had a way to legally neutralize your authority. I thought—" He stopped again. "You thought it was protection," she said. "I thought it was—" "Yes." She looked at the document, at Lucien, at Cassian. "He told you I was a threat," she said. "He told me you were waiting," Cassian said. "That you'd been building alliances with the old families since the first year of our marriage. That Marini and Crisafulli were yours, not mine, and had been since before our wedding. That you married me to gain access to the Viscari network, and were planning to absorb it into D'Aurelio control once you'd mapped it completely." She heard every word. She heard the architecture of it, the patience, the layering, the way Lucien had placed each piece of information at precisely the moment when Cassian's psychology was most receptive to it. Not all at once, over years. Building a portrait of his wife as a patient predator, one careful brushstroke at a time, until Cassian looked at her and saw something she had never been. "And you believed him," she said. Cassian's face. "I didn't want to," he said. "I spent 2 years not believing it, and then—" His voice caught on something and he pushed through it. "And then he showed me a record of a meeting, you and Marini, in Geneva, 14 months ago. A hotel I recognized, the 2 of you for 4 hours. She went cold. Geneva. 14 months ago. She and Marini had met to discuss the conditions under which the old families would accept reactivation, what she would need to be able to offer them, what guarantees, what structure. A planning meeting. Absolutely real. Completely innocent of the interpretation Lucian had placed on it and presented to Cassian with whatever framing had produced the expression she was looking at right now. A meeting I knew about, she said carefully. The record showed a money transfer, 3 million euros. Marini to an account in your name. She looked at Marini. Marini's face had gone still in a specific way. There was no transfer, Marini said. His voice was flat. I know that now, Cassian said. He was looking at Lucien. I know it now. Lucien had not moved. He was watching the room with the expression of a man recalculating, assessing which variables had shifted and which levers were still operational. You fabricated financial records, Seraphine said to him. I prepared contingencies, he said. You fabricated evidence to convince my husband that I was stealing from his organization. I gave him information that supported a conclusion I needed him to reach, Lucien said, with the patience of someone explaining something elementary. The conclusion was necessary. Without it, he wouldn't have made the move tonight. Without tonight, I know what you needed from tonight, she said. Then you understand it was nothing personal. She looked at him for a long moment. Lucien, she said, I need you to understand something. He waited. Nothing about this was ever personal for me either, she said. I am the daughter of a house that was burned to the ground by men who confused personal with strategic. I learned early that the two categories must be kept separate. She folded the document in her hands. But I also learned that when you design an architecture this complex, this layered, this dependent on every piece remaining in position, the thing that destroys it is always the piece you were most certain about. She looked at the two men who had come in behind Cassian, the ones she didn't recognize. Who are they? She asked Cassian. Cassian glanced back. Something in his face, not quite a tell, but near one. They came with Druet, he said. She looked at Druet, still standing near the door. Druet looked at Seraphine and did not quite meet her eyes. The cold came back. Different cold. Deeper. She looked at the document in her hands. She looked at Lucien, who was watching her with an expression that had shifted, the calculation behind the pale eyes adjusting, something moving in them that looked almost like anticipation. She looked at Cassian. These men didn't come with Druet, she said. Cassian didn't answer fast enough. Cassian, her voice was very steady. Who are these men? The room changed, not in any loud way. In the way a room changes when everyone in it simultaneously understands that the thing they thought was the floor is actually a door, and the door is open, and beneath it is not ground, but air. Pharaoh moved first, not toward the two men, but toward Seraphine, and the movement was protective, and that told her more than the silence had. Marini's hand had gone inside his jacket. One of Lucien's peripheral men had shifted his weight. The two men behind Cassian were not reaching for weapons. They didn't need to, because Cassian was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and could not fully name except that it contained something she had never prepared for, not in 7 years, not in all her mapping and cataloging and reading of rooms. It contained the expression of a man who has made a choice he cannot come back from and knows it, and has not yet decided how to live inside that knowledge. Lucien came to me, Cassian said, this afternoon, before the gala. She waited. He told me that tonight, that what you were planning tonight was going to end with me dead or removed, and that I had one window to prevent it. His voice was barely above the ambient noise of the building. He told me that if I made the gesture in the ballroom, stripped your position publicly, he could manage the fallout and maintain my leadership, and that the D'Aurelio thing would stay contained. He stopped. He said you'd been planning this for years, that the kneeling, the 7 men, that it was staged months ago, that you'd coordinated it. It was, she said. He said it was a coup. It was also that, she said, and you decided to believe that framing. I didn't know what to... These 2 men, she said, who sent them. Cassian's face was doing the thing it had done in the ballroom, the terrible recalculation, the arithmetic of a man discovering that the numbers he's been using are wrong. But underneath it now was something that had not been there in the ballroom, something that looked like it had already happened and was not reversible. They're not here for Lucien, she said. Cassian closed his eyes. Cassian, she said, look at me. He opened his eyes. They're here for me, she said. He didn't answer. And in his silence, in the 7 seconds of utter stillness that followed, Seraphine understood the full architecture of the night. Not Lucien's architecture, which she'd been reading for hours, but the layer beneath it, the thing that had been running parallel, the piece she had genuinely not seen coming, not because she'd been careless, but because she had made one fundamental error in all her planning. She had accounted for Lucien. She had accounted for Vivienne. She had accounted for the old families, for Pharaoh's loyalty, for Marini's patience, for every piece on the board that she could see. She had not accounted for the possibility that Cassian, her own careful, complicated, irreplaceable Cassian, the one variable she had never fully allowed herself to read clearly because reading him clearly required acknowledging things she had no budget for, had made a separate deal. Not with Lucien, with someone else entirely. And the two men standing behind him were not his protection. They were the delivery mechanism for an arrangement that had been made before tonight, before the gala, before the crimson crest left her throat. An arrangement she was only now seeing the shape of, here, in this building, with nowhere left to go and the full weight of what trust costs pressing down on her like the ceiling of a room that has run out of air. 7 seconds. That was how long the room held its breath. Then everything happened at once. Pharaoh moved left, putting his body between Seraphine and the two men behind Cassian. Not a decision, a reflex, the kind of movement that lives below conscious thought in men who have spent their lives making it. Marini came off the wall with his hand already out of his jacket. One of Lucien's peripheral men brought up a weapon and drew it, who had sat in the car with his hands on his knees and breathed evenly and said almost nothing, put him down with 2 steps and an elbow strike that was so efficient it looked choreographed. The two men behind Cassian reached. Cassian turned. What happened next was not what anyone in the room had calculated, including Seraphine. Cassian hit the nearer man across the throat with the edge of his hand, open palm, lateral, the specific strike of someone who learned to fight before he learned to manage. And when the man folded, Cassian took the weapon out of his hand before he hit the floor. He turned to the second man, put the weapon against his sternum, and said one word. Don't. The second man didn't. The room went still again. Seraphine exhaled. Cassian turned to face her. I was breathing hard, the exertion moving through him visibly, color in his face and his jaw set and the weapon hanging at his side. And he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just made an irreversible choice and is standing in it and needs her to understand what it cost. I made an agreement, he said, this afternoon. I know. With a man named Gerhardt. He runs... I know who Gerhardt is, she said. He offered me... Cassian. Her voice was not unkind. I don't need the details right now. I need to know if there are more of his people outside. A beat. 6, he said. In the vehicle that followed us. I told them to hold on the road. How long will they hold? Until I signal. And if you don't signal? He looked at her. Then they come in. She looked at the room. At the current geometry of it, Lucien still standing near the dry dock, his remaining men repositioned, several of them uncertain in the way of people whose employer has not told them whether the situation has changed. At Vivienne in the chair, who had gone very white and very still. At Pharaoh covering the 2 downed men. At Marini, weapon out, eyes moving. At Drouet, who had taken a position near the personnel door with the calm efficiency of a man who has decided which side of the room he's on and is not revisiting it. She looked at Lucien. You knew about Gerhardt, she said. Lucien's expression didn't change. I introduced them, he said. Gerhardt and Cassian, 18 months ago. You introduced... Cassian started. Of course I did, Lucien said. Every piece of this was introduced by someone. That's how architecture works. You don't find the materials yourself, you source them. He looked at Cassian with the expression of a craftsman regarding a tool that has just done something unexpected. I didn't anticipate you'd turn on your own agreement at the last moment. That was... a pause. A variable I miscalculated. You miscalculated me, Cassian said. Yes, Lucien said. He sounded almost impressed. I did. You've been miscalculating me for 18 years. For the last 3 minutes, perhaps. Cassian looked at Seraphine. She looked back at him. The moment between them was the most honest thing in the room.
stripped of strategy, stripped of performance. Two people standing in the wreckage of a marriage that had been built on misunderstanding and weaponized against itself, and both of them knowing it, and both of them in the same room with the man who had built the weapon. "What do you need me to do?" Cassian said. She told him. What followed was not elegant. Nothing that happens in a dry dock facility at 2:30 in the morning with a mixed group of people who have conflicting loyalties and live weapons is elegant. But it was fast, and it was controlled, and Seraphine directed it the way she'd directed everything for 7 years. Quietly, without redundancy, each instruction carrying its full weight in the minimum number of words. Pharaoh took the two downed men and secured them to the dock rigging with zip ties from somewhere on his person, which told her Pharaoh had been expecting something since before they'd left the Palazzo Meridian. Marini coordinated with the 3 men of his own, who'd come through a secondary entrance she hadn't known about, but which Marini had identified on approach, because Marini prepared for things. Druitt held the personnel door and nobody came through it that wasn't accounted for.
Lucien's remaining men, 4 of them, the 2 from the periphery and 2 she hadn't placed until they moved, made a collective decision in the compressed moment between Cassian's reversal and the repositioning of everyone else. 3 of them put their weapons down. 1 didn't. The one who didn't was a man near the back wall, older than the others, with the particular stillness of someone who is not hired for a job but committed to a cause. And the distinction was important because hired men can be bought back and committed men cannot. He was looking at Lucien with the expression of someone waiting for a signal. Lucien didn't give it. "Stand down," Lucien said to him. His voice was completely even. The man looked at him. "We're not finished," Lucien said, "but we're not doing it here. Not now." The man stood down. Seraphine noted that. The fact that Lucien still had enough authority over at least one person in this room to pull them back from the edge meant that the edges of his organization extended further than what she could see, and the part she couldn't see was the part that would keep her awake at 3 in the morning for the next several months if she let it. She would deal with that later. Right now she crossed the room toward Vivienne. Vivienne looked up at her with the expression of someone who has been sitting in a chair in a dangerous building for the last hour and has processed most of what happened and has arrived at a place beyond shock, which is a flat, clear, cold kind of attention. Her red dress was wrinkled. Her hair had come partially loose. She looked like herself stripped of the performance, which was more interesting than the performance had been. "Are you hurt?" Seraphine said. "No." Vivienne's voice was steady. "Are you?" "No." A pause. "The crest," Vivienne said. "I left it on the table." "I know. I didn't, Vivienne stopped, started again. "When he put it on me. I didn't know what I was agreeing to." "I know that too," Seraphine said. Vivienne looked at her for a long moment with the specific assessment of a woman who has spent years reading other women and who does not make the mistake of confusing kindness with weakness. "What happens now?" she said. "Now you stand up," Seraphine said, "and you stay close to Pharaoh. And when we leave this building, you get in the car and you go somewhere that isn't your apartment or any address Cassian has on file for you, because Gerhardt's 6 people are on the road outside and they're about to be very unhappy." Vivienne stood. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, a composed gesture that was more muscle memory than vanity. "Where do I go?" "I'll give you an address. You'll be met." She paused. "You're going to be asked questions. Answer them honestly, all of them." Vivienne looked at her. "You want to know how much I knew?" "I want to know everything you know," Seraphine said, "which I suspect is considerably more than you've told anyone." Vivienne said nothing for a moment. Then, "Lucien approached me 14 months ago." The room shifted. Everyone who could hear her heard her, and the ones who couldn't hear her read the shift and turned. "He told me Cassian was going to leave his wife," Vivienne said. Her voice was even, measured, the voice of someone who has decided that the only remaining asset she has is accurate information delivered without embellishment. "He told me it would happen within a year. He told me that if I was positioned correctly when it happened, I would be," she paused, "established, secure, that the Vescari name would carry me." Cassian was listening from 10 feet away. His face was doing something contained and terrible. "He gave me information," Vivienne said, "about Seraphine, about her movements, her meetings. He told me she was building a rival power base. that Cassian needed to know. He said if I told Cassian, it would accelerate the timeline, that Cassian would move faster. She looked at Cassian. I told you about the Geneva meeting, about the money. Cassian's jaw was a hard line. I didn't fabricate anything, Vivian said. He gave me documents. I passed them to you. I didn't know they were… She stopped. I should have known. Yes, Cassian said one word. I know, she said. I'm telling you now. The silence after that had a different quality than the silences before it, less like a held breath and more like something finally put down. Seraphine looked at Lucian. He was watching the exchange with the expression of a man who has had a piece of his design revealed and is assessing the damage with the professional detachment of someone who has accepted that not every plan survives contact and is already drafting revisions. It was a remarkable quality, she thought, the ability to stand in a room where your architecture is being disassembled in real time and remain genuinely calm about it. Most people would call it sociopathy. She called it a particular kind of discipline, which made it more dangerous, not less. Gerhardt, she said to Lucian. What was his piece of this? Territory, Lucian said. The Eastern Mediterranean corridor. Chrysofuli's routes. Once the Dorelio authority was conveyed and the accord restructured under my direction, those routes would be reassigned. To Gerhardt. To a holding entity Gerhardt and I share. She looked at him. You've been building your own syndicate. Inside Cassian's, for 18 years. I've been building an alternative, he said. One that functions on rational principles rather than inherited mythology and bloodline sentiment. He said the last two words with the specific distaste of someone who has spent decades watching irrational systems produce irrational outcomes and has simply run out of patience for it. The D'Aurelio authority is a relic, a story old men tell to justify why they should be deferred to. I intended to take it and use it once and then dissolve it. By killing me afterward, she said. By making you irrelevant afterward, he said, which is cleaner. How considerate. It's practical, he said. I'm always practical. The personnel door burst open, not Druitt's side. The door swung inward from a secondary entrance she hadn't marked on her mental map of the building, a service access on the dock's far side, and through it came three men moving fast and already positioned, and the one in front was someone she recognized because she had made it her business to know every face that mattered in a 600-kilometer radius, Gerhardt's people. Not 6 on the road. Some of them were already inside. The room exploded. Not metaphorically, a weapon discharged somewhere to her left, the sound enormous in the corrugated metal space, and the muzzle flashed through shadows in all directions, and her ears rang with it, and she was already moving before she'd consciously decided to move, dropping low and left, toward the dock rigging, putting mass between herself and the incoming fire. Pharaoh was shouting something. Marini's people were returning fire, and the sound was layered and continuous, and the dry dock facility, which had been built for industrial purposes, and not for acoustics, was bouncing the noise in ways that made it impossible to locate direction cleanly. She hit the ground behind a support strut and stayed flat and breathed and took inventory. Vivian was down. Not shot, she'd dropped to the floor with the intelligent speed of someone who understands the geometry of crossfire. She was flat behind the chair she'd been sitting in, hands over her head, not moving. Pharaoh was behind the dock mechanism, weapon up, trading fire with one of the incoming men. Marini had taken a hit. She could see it in the way he was moving, the left shoulder, his left arm, not raising fully, but he was still moving and still coordinating his two men, and she filed the injury and moved on. Druitt was not visible. Cassian was not visible. She raised her head enough to scan. Lucian's remaining men had scattered in the confusion, some of them into cover, some of them toward the secondary entrance, one of them flat on the floor with his hands spread, having made the very practical decision that the best position available was one that did not draw fire from either direction. Lucian himself was moving, not toward the fight, away from it, toward the far end of the dock where the structure extended into darkness beyond the range of the standing floodlights, where there was a door she knew about because she'd seen it on the building's original schematic when she'd pulled the file 8 months ago. A dockmaster's office, a storage corridor, and at the end of it, an external exit to the water side of the facility. She moved, flat, fast, using the dock rigging and the equipment housing as cover, covering 30 feet in a crouch that her knees would complain about tomorrow. She came around the end of the dock and into the relative darkness of the far section, and she could see Lucian ahead of her, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has a plan and is executing it and knows that running creates visibility and speed creates noise. "Lucien," she said. He stopped. He turned. He had a weapon. She'd known he had a weapon because Lucian Moretti had carried a weapon every day for 18 years, and she had never once seen him deploy it, which was its own kind of information about how he used it. He raised it. She was already to his left, and his tracking was a half-second behind her, and in that half-second she covered the remaining distance and hit his weapon hand upward, and the discharge went into the ceiling, and the sound in the enclosed corridor was a physical assault, and her hearing went to a high flat tone that blotted everything else out. They were very close together in the dark. She had his weapon hand at the wrist, and he had his free hand at her forearm, and they were both breathing hard, and the fight was not elegant. Nothing about this was elegant. It was the fight of two people who do not fight professionally. Grappling in the dark with high stakes and insufficient space, and she was smaller than him, but she was faster than him, and she'd been trained in things that don't appear on any official record by a man who'd burned before she could remember his face, and she used them. She took the weapon. Lucian stepped back. His breathing was audible now, the exertion breaking through the composure, and in the dim light from the distant floodlights, she could see his face reassembling itself from the shock of the last 30 seconds into something that was not quite its former expression, but was trying to be. "You're going to shoot me," he said. "I haven't decided," she said. "Seraphine." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not fear. Fear was too simple a word for what was in his voice. It was something more like the sound of a man arriving at the outer limit of his own design, where the contingencies run out and there is nothing left but the raw fact of the situation. "Everything I built, everything I planned. You understand the scope of it. 18 years, the organization I would have created would have been yours," she said. "Yes." "That's the part you don't understand," she said. "It was never supposed to be anyone's." He looked at her. "The Accord," she said. "The Dorelio Authority. My family didn't hold it to use it. They held it to prevent it from being used, as a deterrent, as a balance. The moment anyone invokes it unilaterally..." She stopped. "The moment anyone uses it as a tool of personal ambition, it stops being what it was. The thing that kept 40 years of peace." She looked at him. "You were going to use it to build an empire." "I was going to use it to build order," he said. "Rational, functional order. Instead of..." He gestured toward the sounds of the ongoing fight at the far end of the building. This is what happens when someone spends 18 years manipulating everyone around him," she said. His jaw tightened. "You're not going to shoot me." "No," she said. "I'm not." She heard footsteps behind her, fast ones. She turned. Cassian came out of the dark with blood on the side of his face. Not his, she determined, in the first second. The pattern was wrong for a head wound, someone else's. And he was moving at full speed, and he didn't stop when he reached her. He moved past her, and he hit Lucian with the kind of force that comes from 18 years of accumulated betrayal finding a single moment of physical expression. Lucian went down. Cassian stood over him, breathing in great ragged pulls, and his hands were shaking. Not from fear, she thought, but from the specific tremor that follows the moment when a body has been running on something beyond its normal fuel and the something runs out. He looked at her. Blood on his face. Jacket gone somewhere. A cut on his forearm that she hadn't seen him sustain. "Are you hurt?" she said. "Yes," he said, which was the most honest answer he'd given to any question all night. "Seriously?" "No." He looked at Lucian on the floor. "It's over?" She looked back toward the main space of the facility. The gunfire had stopped. The silence that followed it was a different silence than the ones before. Exhausted, settling, the silence of a thing concluded rather than suspended. "In there," she said. "Yes." "And out there?" he said. The question was not about the building. She understood what he was asking. "That," she said, "is going to take considerably longer." He looked at her. The blood on his face, the cut on his arm, the expression that was not the expression of Cassian Viscari, who ran the Romano Syndicate, but something underneath it. The man who had existed before the architecture, before the title,
Before the weight of a name that had been placed on him so early, it had become indistinguishable from his own skin.
I believed him, Cassian said. About Geneva. I know.
3 years ago, when he first started, I had doubts. And I chose Cassian. Her voice was quiet and direct.
We will have this conversation. All of it. Every piece. But not here, not now, not with Lucien on the floor, and Marini shot, and Gerhardt's people, somewhere in this building. He closed his eyes, opened them, nodded. She turned back toward the main space. Marini was upright, which was the first thing she checked. Left arm immobilized. He'd fashioned something from his jacket to hold it, the efficient improvisation of someone who has been shot before and knows that functional is more important than comfortable. He met her eyes and lifted his chin, the shorthand of a man communicating that he is operational. 3 of Gerhardt's people were secured, 2 of Lucien's, the ones who hadn't run. The man who'd been on the floor with his hands spread was still there, not moving, apparently having decided that the position remained optimal. Pharaoh came toward her from the dock side of the room. There was a gash above his eyebrow, and he was pressing a folded piece of fabric to it that she suspected was his pocket square. 2 of theirs are gone, he said, out the secondary entrance. They'll call Gerhardt. Yes. How long before he sends more? Pharaoh thought about it. Hour. Maybe less. He's not local, so he's working with what he pre-positioned. An hour. She looked at the room, at the people in it, at the crimson crest, which no one had moved since Vivian had set it on the table at the Palazzo Meridian. It wasn't here. It was there. It was sitting on a table next to a half-empty wine glass at a party that had become something else while no one was watching. She looked at Vivian, who had gotten up from the floor and was standing near the wall with her arms folded, and her expression the expression of a woman who has survived the last 2 hours through a combination of intelligence and stillness, and is now doing a very thorough accounting of what she owes, what she's lost, and what the remaining options look like. There's a vehicle in the back, Seraphine said to Pharaoh. Lucien's, not ours. Keys? Pharaoh looked at one of the secured men. The man, assessing the room and the options, decided honesty was the practical choice and told him where they were. Marini's people take Lucien and the secured men out the dockside exit, she said. The vehicle goes to a location Marini will specify. Marini, you'll need... I'll manage, Marini said. His voice had the particular flat quality of a man who has been shot and has decided that the pain is not relevant to current operations. I know you will. She looked at Vivian. With Pharaoh. Now. Vivian moved. Seraphine looked at Cassian. He was standing near the dock mechanism, one hand resting on it, not for support, but as a grounding gesture, the kind of contact with a physical object that a person makes when they need to feel the solidity of something real. There's a summit, she said, the 7 families. It was scheduled for 3 days from now, but it needs to happen tomorrow. The abandoned cathedral on the Via Sacra. Marini knows it. It's where the original accord was signed. Cassian looked at her. You're going to invoke it. I'm going to do something with it, she said. Not what Lucien planned. Something else. You had this planned before tonight. I had this planned before our wedding, she said. The honesty of it landed between them. You married me, he said slowly, because the Romano Syndicate was the largest single organization operating under the 1953 Accord, and its stability was essential to the function of the authority, and you were about to make a series of decisions that would have destabilized it within 5 years, she said, and because Lucien had specifically positioned you as the entry point, and I needed to understand why. And did you? Eventually, she said. It took 3 years. And then you stayed. She looked at him. You could have invoked the authority at any point, he said, after you understood. You didn't need to wait for tonight. You didn't need to be in that ballroom. He paused. Why did you stay? She looked at him for a long time, at the blood on his face and the cut on his arm, and the expression of a man standing in the ruins of everything he thought he understood about his own life, and still standing, which was its own answer to a question she hadn't asked. I'm going to need you tomorrow, she said. At the summit, your presence, your voice, your acknowledgement of what happened tonight and what it means. That's not what I asked, he said. I know, she said. A sound from outside, distant but approaching. Engines. More than one.
Gerhardt's hour had been an optimistic estimate. She looked at the door, at the room, at Cassian. "We need to go," she said. Seraphine, now Cassian. He pushed off the dock mechanism and came toward her, and as he passed her, he put one hand briefly against the side of her face. Not a caress, not an apology. Something that didn't have a clean name. The gesture of a man communicating something he doesn't have words for. To a woman he has spent 7 years failing to see clearly. And then his hand dropped, and he was moving toward the exit, and she was behind him. And the engines outside were getting louder, and the night was nowhere near finished, and every decision she was about to make in the next 12 hours would determine what the next 40 years of this world looked like. She ran her thumb across her own collarbone, where the crimson crest had sat for 7 years, and where its absence now felt like the weight of everything still to come. Then she moved. They came out of the dry dock facility through the waterside exit, 6 of them moving in the dark along the quay wall, with the engines of Gerhardt's vehicles audible now on the service road behind the building. 2 minutes, maybe less. The water was black and flat and smelled like the sea always smells at the end of something. Seraphine moved without running, which set the pace for everyone behind her. Running was noise and visibility and the communication of panic, and panic was the one thing she could not afford to let into the group's body language, because panicked people made choices that compounded rather than resolved, and everything that happened in the next 36 hours depended on choices that held together under pressure. Marini's secondary vehicle was where he'd said it would be. 50 meters along the quay, lights off, engine running, a man at the wheel who looked at the approaching group with the expression of someone who has been told to expect complications and is not surprised by them. They got in. Cassian was the last one. He stood at the quay for 3 seconds before getting in the car, and in those 3 seconds he looked back at the dry dock facility, at the building that contained Lucien, contained the secured men, contained the residue of 18 years of a design that had just been dismantled in a single night. He looked at it with the expression of a man looking at something he helped build without knowing it, and then he got in the car and pulled the door shut and the vehicle moved. Nobody spoke for the first 4 minutes. Then Pharaoh said from the front, "The summit, via Sakra. Who knows we're coming?" "Marini will send word," Seraphine said. "The 7 families were on standby. They've been on standby since the Palazzo Meridian." "Since before," Cassian said. She looked at him. "They were already traveling when they arrived tonight," he said. "Those weren't men who got a call and drove across town. Marini came from JFK. Leclerc came through Geneva. That's not... You didn't organize that in an evening." "No," she said. "How long?" "The standby protocol has been in place for 3 years," she said, "since I understood the shape of what Lucien was building. I needed to know that if I triggered it, the response would be fast enough to matter." Cassian absorbed that. 3 years, he said. "Yes. You've been running a parallel operation inside my organization for 3 years. I've been maintaining a contingency," she said. "There's a difference." "There isn't, actually." She looked at him. He was right, and she didn't insult either of them by pretending otherwise. "No," she said, "there isn't." The city moved past the windows. At 3 in the morning, it had the particular quality of a place between states. Not the night, not yet the day. The empty interval when the streets belong to the people who work in the dark and the people who can't sleep. And both groups move through it with the same awareness that the ordinary rules are temporarily suspended. Pharaoh's phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Gerhardt's people went into the facility," he said. "Found it empty. They're going to assume we took a boat." "Good," Seraphine said. "Let them look at the water." "For how long?" "Long enough." She looked at her own hands in her lap. The conveyance document, Lucien's document, 2 years in preparation, was folded in the inside pocket of her wrap, which she'd retrieved from somewhere in the confusion of the last 2 hours. She'd taken it from the floor near the dock when no one was watching, not because she intended to sign it, because documents that specific, that legally constructed, that deeply sourced in D'Aurelio family language, were not drafted without access to someone who understood the original records intimately, which meant Lucien had a source she hadn't identified, someone who knew the D'Aurelio documentation from the inside. She was going to need to find that person before the summit, before she invoked anything, before she put herself in front of 7 families and asked them to accept a restructuring that depended on the integrity of an authority whose documentation had been accessed by the man who'd spent 18 years trying to steal it. She looked at Cassian.
The document Lucian had prepared, she said. He needed access to the original D'Aurelio records to draft it. Specific language, specific formulations. He couldn't have built it from secondary sources. Cassian was quiet for a moment. Edoardo Falcone, he said. She went still. He was at the gala tonight, Cassian said. Lucian and Falcone have met 3 times in the last 18 months that I know of. I thought it was standard relationship maintenance. Lucian managed relationships with the old guard. That was his function. She thought about Edoardo. The coffee at the bar. You look tired. The way he'd watched the room from the edges. The conversation about Cassian drinking since 5. The question he'd asked her, is there anything you need me to do tonight? And her answer, no. Thank you, Edoardo. The courtesy of an old man, or the courtesy of a man who'd already done what he needed to do and was giving her the chance to exit cleanly. He gave Lucian the language, she said. I think so. Why? Cassian turned his hands over in his lap. He has a daughter, he said. Youngest one. She's been sick, 2 years. There's a treatment. Experimental, European, very expensive. He's been paying for it. A pause. Lucian would have known that. She thought about Edoardo Falcone's hands on his glass, not drinking. The stillness of a man carrying something very heavy, very quietly, for a very long time. He didn't give Lucian everything, she said. The conveyance document was wrong in 3 places. The formulations were close, but not exact. If the document had been presented to the families, anyone who'd seen the original would have identified the errors within an hour. Cassian looked at her. He sabotaged it. He gave Lucian enough to keep him satisfied and not enough to make it work, she said. Edoardo Falcone has been managing Lucian Moretti for 18 months and making sure the document he received would fail on examination, while letting you think he might be the leak. He wanted me to find it, she said. He wanted me to run the check, because if I ran the check and found the errors, I'd know the document was flawed before I ever had to face it in a room full of people. She looked out the window. He's been protecting the authority, the same way he's always protected it, the way the old ones always did, not by fighting for it, but by making sure the weapons built against it don't quite work. The car was quiet. Pharaoh turned in the front seat. So the document is useless. Lucian's document, yes. Then tonight was never about the document, she said. It was about moving him, getting him to deploy his resources, expose his network, put his people in the field where they could be identified. The document was the bait he built for me. I let him think it was working. She paused. And he let me think he was calmer than he was. Pharaoh looked at her for a long moment. How much of tonight was planned? Parts of it. Which parts? The parts that went correctly, she said. It was the closest thing to humor she'd offered since the Palazzo Meridian, and Pharaoh acknowledged it with the small exhale that was the closest thing to a laugh available to him right now. And in the front of the car, the driver's shoulders dropped by a fraction, and the tension in the vehicle shifted into something slightly more survivable. They drove the rest of the way to the Via Sacra in silence. The cathedral was not in use, had not been in regular use for decades. It occupied a corner lot in a part of the old city that had been industrialized around it, and then unindustrialized and left in the uncertain state of a place that doesn't know yet what it's going to become. And the cathedral sat in the center of that uncertainty with the patience of stone, which is the most durable patience available. Inside, the pews had been removed at some point and replaced by nothing, so the nave was a long empty space with a stone floor and high windows that let in the particular gray of the hour before dawn. Someone had placed chairs. Not many. 12, arranged in a rough circle in the center of the nave. 7 of them were occupied by the time Seraphine walked in. Marini was already there, his arm now in a proper sling fashioned from someone's jacket lining, his face carrying the specific translucent quality of a man who has lost blood and replaced it with stubbornness. He stood when she entered, and she shook her head slightly, and he sat back down. The 7 men of the families were in their chairs. Salvatore Marini, Remy Leclerc, Aldo Crisafulli, Beaumont, Testa, and 2 others she'd met only once each, but whose presence meant that the signal had gone out and been honored, which was its own form of the answer she'd needed. They were all looking at her. She stood in the center of the circle. Cassian came in behind her and stood to the side, outside the ring of chairs. Not invited in, not excluded, simply present in the way of a man who has accepted that his role in this particular room is witness rather than principal, and who has made peace with that in the last 40 minutes. Pharaoh stood near the door. Seraphine looked at the 7 men. "You know what happened tonight," she said. Not a question. Several of them nodded. The ones who didn't had gotten enough in the last hour from Marini's people to understand the shape of it. "Lucien Moretti is in custody," she said. "Not legal custody. Ours. He will remain there until this body decides what to do with him, which is not a decision for tonight." She paused. "Gerhardt will be a problem for the next several weeks. He has resources in the Eastern Corridor and he's going to be angry. That's manageable. We'll manage it together." "The Accord," Chrysophouli said. His voice was the voice of a man who has been in this business since before Seraphine was born and who cuts directly to what matters. "You're going to invoke it." "I'm going to restructure it," she said. Meaning the 1953 Compact has 17 provisions. 4 of them are functional. The other 13 are historical artifacts that have been used for 60 years as justification for territorial claims that produce exactly the kind of conflict we saw tonight. She looked at him. "I'm going to dissolve the 13, codify the 4, and add 3 new provisions that address what the original accord didn't contemplate because it was 1953 and the world was different." Chrysophouli looked at her. "You have the authority to do that." "Yes." "And the documentation?" "Yes." She reached into her wrap and withdrew a folded document. Not Lucian's document, a different one, older, the paper the color of old cream, the ink faded in the specific way of something that has been protected rather than neglected. The original, the bloodline register, the seal. She placed it on the floor in the center of the ring of chairs. "The D'Aurelio archive has been in a safety deposit box in a bank in Geneva for 26 years, under my mother's name. I retrieved it 14 months ago." The room looked at the document on the floor. Testa, the old Sardinian, leaned forward in his chair. His eyes, when they found the document, had something in them that was not sentimentality exactly, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man seeing something he'd been told was lost, and had accepted as lost, and is now confronting the fact that some losses are not permanent. "I have a condition," Seraphine said. The room waited. "The authority doesn't transfer to me personally," she said. "It transfers to the compact itself, to this body. The D'Aurelio bloodline ratifies the restructuring, and then the bloodline authority goes dormant, formally, documented, witnessed. It will exist as a safeguard. A lock on the restructured compact that requires D'Aurelio ratification to dissolve. But it will not be an active power. It will not be a throne." She looked at each of them in turn. "Nobody gets a throne. That was the fundamental problem with the original design, and it's going to be the fundamental problem with any new design unless we name it directly and build against it." Leclerc said, "And Moretti's network. The infrastructure he built inside the Romano organization over 18 years. That doesn't disappear because we restructure the accord." "No," she said. "It doesn't. We'll need to identify it, all of it. That's going to take months, and it's going to be uncomfortable because some of what we find will be inside your own organizations, not just Cassian's." Lucien was thorough. She paused. "I'll share everything I have, everything I've gathered in 3 years. The files, the financial trails, the personnel. All of it goes to this body, collectively, and we work through it together." "That's a significant disclosure," Beaumont said. "Yes," she said, "it is. You'd be exposing your own methods." "I'd be exposing the methods I use to protect an authority that belongs to all of you," she said. "Yes, I know what that costs." Silence. Then Marini from his chair with his wounded arm and his pale face and his voice that had not wavered once in the last 6 hours. "I'll second the restructuring." One by one, around the circle, the others nodded. Some of them spoke. Some of them just inclined their heads, which in this room, with these men, carried the same weight as a signed document. Testa was last. He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face was the accumulated weight of a man who has outlived most of the people he respected and has arrived at a point in his life where the things that seemed large have reduced to their essential components, and the things that seemed small
have revealed unexpected depth. Your mother, he said. Elena d'Aurelio, Theo. I knew her. Seraphine looked at him. She would have done this differently, he said. Elena would have kept the authority active, would have used it. She was not, he paused, choosing his word carefully. She was not inclined toward restraint.
I know, Seraphine said. You're not her. No. That's not a criticism, he said. He sat back. I second the restructuring. She knelt on the stone floor and opened the original document and signed it with a pen someone produced from somewhere, and the signature was not elegant. Her hand was not entirely steady, which was the most honest thing about the entire night, that at the end of it, the woman who had been composed through 4 hours of betrayal and gunfire, and the worst kind of emotional reckoning, had a hand that shook slightly when it came time to write her real name in the presence of witnesses for the first time in 7 years. She signed it. She straightened. She stood in the center of the ring of chairs in an empty cathedral as the windows began to pale with the first suggestion of dawn, and she felt, not triumph, not relief, nothing that clean. She felt the specific exhaustion of a thing completed, the weight of it dropping from her in the way weight drops when you've been carrying it so long you'd forgotten it was separate from you. The men rose. She had not told them to. They simply rose, the way they had knelt in front of the Palazzo Meridian, without ceremony, without announcement, because some things are understood rather than directed. It lasted for a moment. Then Testa turned and walked toward the door with the careful steps of a very old man who has spent a long night sitting in a cold building, and the gesture broke the formality in the way it needed to be broken, and the room began to move again. Cassian was still standing near the wall. She walked toward him. He watched her come with the expression he'd been carrying since the dry dock, the expression that didn't have a name in his usual vocabulary, the one that lived below the authority and the strategy and the 18 years of being Cassian Vescari at all times. He was holding the crimson crest. She hadn't seen him pick it up. He must have retrieved it from the table at the Palazzo Meridian before they left, in the compressed chaos of the departure. She hadn't noticed. She noticed most things, and she hadn't noticed that. He held it out. She looked at it. It belongs with the documentation, he said. It should be part of whatever archive you're building. It's a Vescari heirloom, she said. It's a symbol, he said. You told me what it actually meant, a ceremonial ornament. 4 generations of my family thinking it was the thing when it was never the thing. He looked at it in his hand. It was real to us. That's worth something, but keeping it doesn't... He stopped. I don't need it to know what I lost, or what I was given that I didn't see. She took it from him. Their hands touched briefly in the exchange, the specific contact of a transaction that is not entirely a transaction, that has something else in it that neither of them has a clean word for and neither of them reaches for, because the time for reaching is not now and may not come. The summit decisions, he said, the restructuring, my organization, the Romano Syndicate, it's going to be different after this. Yes. Is it still mine? She looked at him. That depends on what you do with it, she said. He absorbed that. Lucien, he said, what happens to him? The families will decide. And if I have an opinion... You can offer it, she said. It will be considered. You're not without standing here, Cassian. You're without the standing you had yesterday. That's different. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Gerhardt offered me the Eastern Corridor, he said, in exchange for... He stopped. For removing you. I know. I was going to do it, he said. For about 6 hours, I was going to do it. And then he stopped again, this time not from editing, but from the genuine difficulty of what he was trying to say, the man beneath the manager struggling with the language of honesty, which is a different language than the one he'd been fluent in. In the car, on the way to the dry dock, you told me what you needed me to do, and you said it the way you've always said things to me, like you'd already thought about whether I was capable of it, and decided I was, without making a production of deciding. He looked at his own hands. Nobody talks to me like that. Like they've already settled the question of whether I can handle the truth. She looked at him. That's not a declaration, he said quickly. I know it's too late for... I'm not asking for anything. I'm telling you what happened in that car because you deserve to know what actually turned it. She was quiet for a moment. It's not too late for everything, she said. He looked up. It's too late for what we were, she said. That marriage, the fiction of it, the managed distance of it, the years of living in the same house like adjacent countries, that's over. It was over before tonight, we just didn't have language for it. She looked at the crimson crest in her hand. But what comes after that isn't nothing. It's just something neither of us knows the shape of yet. He looked at her for a long time with the look she'd spent 7 years not quite allowing herself to read clearly. Okay, he said. One word, carefully placed. She turned toward the door. Seraphine, he said. She stopped. Your real name, he said. Your full name. I've been saying it in my head for the last hour, but I only know the first part. She turned back. Seraphine Alcione d'Aurelio, she said. He said it back to her quietly, trying the weight of it. Not as a greeting or a declaration. The way you say a name when you are learning that the person you've been looking at and the person you've been seeing are not the same person, and you are beginning the work of reconciling the two. Go home, she said. Get that arm looked at. Sleep if you can. The next 3 weeks are going to require everything you have. He went. She stood alone in the emptying cathedral as the light coming through the high windows shifted from gray to the pale, undecided color that precedes actual dawn, the light that is not yet committed to being day. Pharaoh came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything, which was why she'd always had a specific kind of respect for Pharaoh. The man understood that some silences are not problems to be filled. After a moment, she said, Vivian. Safe, he said. The address you gave me, she's there. She'll need to make a statement to the families about what she passed to Cassian, the fabricated financial record. She knows. She'll cooperate? Pharaoh considered. I think she's tired, he said. Of all of it. I think she's been tired for a while, and this was the night that made it impossible to pretend otherwise. He paused. She asked me one thing. When I got her to the address. Seraphine waited. She asked if you were going to be all right, Pharaoh said. Seraphine looked at him. I told her I thought so, Pharaoh said. What did she say? She said good. Pharaoh looked at the windows, at the light coming through. That was it, just good. Seraphine looked at the document in her hands, at the crimson crest, at the signatures on the restructuring, her real name in her own handwriting, shaking slightly, on old paper that had spent 26 years in a Geneva bank under a dead woman's name, her mother's name, Elena d'Aurelio, who would have done this differently, who was not inclined toward restraint, who had run an authority that held 40 years of fragile peace together through force of will and the specific kind of presence that fills a room before you enter it, and who had died in a burning house when her daughter was 4 years old, and who would be the absence at the center of every room Seraphine walked into for the rest of her life. She folded the document and placed it inside the wrap beside Lucian's useless conveyance paper, and she held the crimson crest for a moment, its weight, its warmth from being held, the rubies that caught even the pale pre-dawn light through the cathedral windows, and held it, which was what rubies did, which was perhaps why someone had chosen them. Then she put it in her pocket. Outside, the city was beginning its first sounds, the specific acoustic signature of an urban morning assembling itself from silence, vehicle engines and distant voices, and the mechanical complaint of a building settling into the day. The sounds of a world that did not know what had happened in a dry dock facility and an empty cathedral in the last 6 hours, and would not know, because these things did not happen in the world's knowledge. They happened in the spaces between what the world knew, in the rooms that didn't appear on any map, in the agreements made between people who understood that the visible surface of things was not where the actual decisions lived. She walked out of the cathedral and into the early morning air. It was cold, colder than the night had been, which is how mornings work. They arrive colder than what preceded them before they warm into themselves. Marini was outside, leaning against the car, his sling visible, his face the color of old plaster. He straightened when he saw her. Go to a doctor, she said. After. After what? After you tell me it's done. She looked at him. At the man who had knelt on a pavement outside the Palazzo Meridian 3 years into a standby protocol she'd asked him to maintain without knowing when it would be triggered, who had sat across from her in a hotel in Geneva for 4 hours discussing the conditions of a reactivation that might never happen, who had taken a bullet in a dry dock facility at 2 in the morning for a restructuring she wasn't sure would hold. It's done, she said. Go to a doctor. He pushed off the car. He He walked toward a second vehicle that was idling at the curb, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain through posture. At the door, he stopped and looked back. "Your mother," he said. "She'd have burned the whole thing down, started over." "I know," Seraphine said. "You didn't," he said. "No." "Is that the right call?" She thought about it, the honest thought, not the managed one. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in 5 years." Marini made a sound that might have been approval and got in the car. She stood on the sidewalk as both cars pulled away and left her in the particular silence of a city street at the boundary between night and morning, in the interval that belonged to neither. The crimson crest was in her pocket. The D'Aurelio archive was in her wrap. 3 weeks of difficult work was ahead. The mapping of Lucian's network, the management of Gerhardt, the ongoing process of convincing 7 families that a restructured compact built on restraint rather than hierarchy was worth maintaining, which was harder than building a hierarchy because hierarchies ran on fear and restraint required something more complex and less reliable. And somewhere in this city, in a house that had been hers for 7 years, while she was also always someone else, a man with a cut on his forearm and blood on his face was taking stock of what remained after a night that had stripped everything down to whatever was actually underneath. She didn't know what was underneath with Cassian. She'd told him that was not nothing, and she'd told him they didn't know the shape of it yet, and both of those things were true, and the truth of them was going to require more than 3 weeks to resolve. She was 41 years old, and she was tired in the specific way that comes from sustained effort over a long time. The tiredness that is not fixed by sleep, but only by the gradual reabsorption of spent energy over days and weeks of ordinary living, which she had not had in a very long time. She started walking, not toward a vehicle, just walking, in the early morning air, in the city that didn't know what had happened inside it, past the storefronts with their metal grates, and the delivery trucks making their first runs, and the occasional pedestrian moving through the gray light, with the particular self-containment of a person who is up before the world and has made their peace with that. She walked until she found a cafe that was open, the kind of place that opens early because its customers need to be somewhere by 6, with fluorescent lights and small tables and coffee that was adequate rather than good. She sat at a table near the window. She ordered coffee. She put her hands around the cup when it came and let the warmth move through her palms, and she looked out the window at the street and the light coming up over the buildings. The actual dawn now, committed and irreversible. The sky going from the undecided color to something that had blue in it, that had the quality of a day beginning in earnest. The cafe filled slowly around her. People in work clothes, people with earphones. A man reading a newspaper with the focused attention of someone who still finds print sufficient. Nobody looked at her. Nobody knew what she was carrying in her pocket, or what she'd signed 2 hours ago on a stone floor, or what the last 7 years had been the preparation for. She was, in this cafe, at this hour, simply a woman with coffee and cold hands and a tiredness that went all the way down. She let herself have that for a little while. The restructuring would hold or it wouldn't. The families would honor the compact or they'd find reasons not to. Because men who have been operating under one system always find reasons to resist another system even when the other system is better. Because change costs something and the cost is always paid in the currency of the familiar. She would manage that problem when it arrived. She would manage Gerhardt and what remained of Lucian's network and the discovery of whoever else had been turned or bought or positioned over 18 years. She would manage all of it. But not right now. Right now, there was coffee and the smell of someone else's breakfast from the kitchen and the sound of the city assembling itself outside the window. The ordinary, irreplaceable sound of a world that had continued through everything, that would go on continuing in its dense and indifferent way through whatever came next. She thought about her mother's name on a safety deposit box in Geneva. She thought about a 4-year-old girl carried out of a burning house by a man whose face she'd spent her whole life trying to reconstruct from the single functional memory she had of it. His hands, large, certain, the smell of him, smoke, and something underneath it, something that was safety before she understood what safety cost. She thought about the way Cassian had said her real name, trying its weight. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. Her right hand was no longer shaking. Outside, the light was fully day. She finished the coffee. She left money on the table and stood and straightened her wrap and picked up what she was carrying and walked out into the morning. And the city received her the way cities receive everyone. without recognition, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement of what has been lost or built or survived. She walked on. The street was long. The day was just beginning. She kept going.